What's going on, everybody? Hope you're doing well out there. Listen, I'm Coach Evan. This is Say Cheese and Lift Studio, and you're listening to the Scout Method Podcast, your one-stop shop for not only physical fitness, but mental fitness, emotional fitness, and spiritual fitness. Listen, I hope you all are doing well. I hope you're doing big things out there. I hope that you're enjoying time with your families. And I hope that you're learning, and I hope that you're growing. I hope that you're becoming more aware. I hope that you're becoming more fit in general. And I hope ultimately that, this podcast over the episodes has given you something to work with here, has given you something to make you think, something that'll help you grow. That's ultimately my hope here at least with the podcast, right? And so this past weekend, I took my son. So my son and I, we went, my oldest son actually, went out to go see Spider-Man Brand New Day. And it's actually the second time I've seen this movie. I love that movie. It's become one of my favorite movies in general, but not for the reasons that you think. And it's interesting because I don't really care about the whole Marvel continuity thing and this, that, and the third, because it's a superhero movie. But it didn't feel like a superhero movie. And look, I'm talking about this for a very specific reason, right? But and I hear all the complaints and all that fun stuff that people have about it. That doesn't affect me either. I just think it was a masterpiece of a movie. And here's why, right? So you get to the end, and I'm not spoiling it or anything like that, but those last scenes were everything to me. And I've realized that there are certain things, certain pieces of entertainment that I had a chance to experience, and I experienced it at the perfect time to have maximum impact, right? And I know that's really wordy to say, but it's Spider-Man Brand New Day came at the perfect time, right? A video game called Expedition 33 came at the perfect time, and it dealt with the perfect topic, right? And so it's just different things like that. And what I mean by perfect time and perfect topic is my and what I mean by all of this really is, at the end of Spider-Man Brand New Day, again, no spoilers or anything like that, but those final scenes, like I said, they were everything, but it just reminded me of me. And it also reminded me of my dad. And for those of you who don't know, my dad passed away last year, and we're about maybe a little under a month from it being, I guess you call it the 1-year anniversary. If that's something you celebrate, I don't know. But it's almost been a year. And I still feel it. I'd be lying if I told you I didn't. And this process of grief is unlike any other. So, at some point after a loss, a lot of grieving people tend to feel it. It's almost like a shift. It's a shift in a way of how the people around them are responding and how the people around them are showing up, right? The calls come less often. The check-ins are a whole bunch shorter, right? They don't call as often, essentially. People start asking those questions, right? They start asking those questions less, and they start making more assumptions, right? And nobody really says it out loud, but the message underneath, the implications are pretty clear, right? It's been a while, so you should be better, or not 100%, but you should be, you should start to move in the right direction now, right? So this episode is about why that expectation, however it shows up, was never built from how grief actually works, and what it eventually ends up costing people who feel like they're failing to keep up with this mysterious process. Grief runs on this kind of unofficial script in this culture. And this script has a runtime that nobody agrees to out loud. So sympathy and check-ins from the people around you tend to be the heaviest in the first couple weeks, maybe up to a month, right? And then they fade from there. So by the time you get to month 2 or 3, a lot of grieving people tend to sense that, even if nobody is going to say it directly, of course, but they sense that the people around them are ready to move on. And none of that timeline was built from how grief actually works. But what it does, it reflects how long the people around you are comfortable sitting with your pain before their own discomfort takes over. But where did this timeline come from? And before I talk about that, I have to be upfront about this one thing first. This isn't a universal rule, for everyone. Like this, everyone doesn't experience this the same way. How much grace someone gets, it varies enormously by relationship, by workplace, by culture, by individual. Some people are given real space for a year plus, and then others feel the pressure within weeks, days even. But the pattern is common enough, and the structural signals, bereavement leave, drop off and check-ins, those are consistent enough that it's worth calling out, and at least talking about it as if it's an actual dynamic and not just a single isolated complaint, or my complaint. See, the 5 stages of grief, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. They were never intended as a timeline or a checklist. See, they were originally observed in terminally ill patients, right? And they were processing their own deaths, not in people grieving a loss or anything like that, right? So, they were coming up with ways to understand how people process what's happening to them and not what has happened to someone else. But the model itself got popularized, and then it got flattened. And then once you get to that point, it gets misapplied. And it became a cultural expectation. You move through the stages, arrive at acceptance, and then you be done with it. And grief researchers has said for years that grief isn't linear, and it doesn't have a fixed endpoint, nor does it resolve the way the popular version of these stages implies. But still, as with a lot of other things, the flattened version stuck. because a linear model with an endpoint is more comfortable for everyone else, including the person grieving who wants to believe there's a finish line. See, the thing is, though, grief doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in waves. And the waves don't shrink predictably over time. You might have big waves, you might have small waves, you might have absolutely crushing waves. And you might have other times where it's not that bad. Anniversaries, certain smells, a piece of music, a movie, a video game, an offhand comment can bring grief back at full intensity years after a loss, even after long stretches of feeling okay. This isn't necessarily a regression, or it isn't a failure to heal either. It's simply how grief works, especially when the loss is significant. The relationship between griever and grief tends to change more than the grief itself shrinks. You don't get smaller pain, in other words. You get a bigger life around the same pain. So people who look fully recovered from the outside are often just more practiced at carrying it. But they're not free from it. But what does this cost us? People start hiding their grief once they sense they've outstayed their welcome with it. The grieving person in that case learns to fake like they've recovered in public, while the actual process continues privately and oftentimes unsupported and alone. This creates another layer of pain, though, right? It's not just the loss now, but the isolation of grieving in silence, because expressing it past the expected window makes other people uncomfortable. And then we have this complicated grief that gets stuck, suppressed, or never actually processed. It often traces back to this exact dynamic. A person who never got the space or time their grief actually required. And I fell prey to this. I never grieved for my grandmother when she passed away. And so there are a whole bunch of processes got stuck. And again, I talk about this ad nauseum. I was determined not to do that same thing with my dad. But even I didn't even understand what that meant. Because the pressure to move on doesn't necessarily make people move on faster. It makes them go underground with something that needed to be witnessed, not hidden. So people around grievers, they tend to get these things wrong. And I think it's well worth it to call this one out too. And I'm not making any harsh indictments of any person that is there. A lot of people have good intentions. They're not trying to be cruel when they rush someone through grief. Again, they're just uncomfortable with the pain they can't fix. And moving the griever along relieves their own discomfort. Statements like they're in a better place, or everything happens for a reason, or at least you had time with them, at least you were able to say goodbye. Those statements often say more about the speaker's need to resolve the discomfort than the griever's actual need. The most helpful thing said to someone grieving is rarely a resolution. It's just a presence. And it doesn't require grief to be tidy. It's just somebody sitting there with you and letting you feel it and letting you work through it. But they're there with you. Checking in on someone months or even years after a loss, especially near the anniversary, is one of the most underused and most valuable things a friend could do. Grief support has the strongest first 2 weeks I've ever seen. But that drop off is pretty steep. Exactly when the person oftentimes needs it the most. And this isn't necessarily uh, a personal cry out for help. It's not that. These are observations. These are things that I've seen. These are things that I've experienced. And I don't think I would be able to speak on it otherwise. So I often have to remind myself. And when I tell you I live the Scowl method, and it's not just something that I made up and pulled together and it was just, I needed something catchy to send out to people. I earnestly live the Scowl method, and that's truly how it came to be. So I'm often reminded of what a sound heart would do in this situation. A sound heart doesn't necessarily mean an unbroken heart. It just means a heart that is capable of holding pain honestly without being ruled by the pressure to act like everything is okay. Grief that gets rushed or suppressed doesn't actually disappear. I can attest to that. And it often resurfaces later as anxiety, as anger. You might even have some physical symptoms or a general numbness that you can't really trace, back to its source. But across all four arenas, healthy processing requires time that doesn't match everyone else's expectations. It doesn't match the cultural expectation. The body heals on its own schedule. The mind deals with trauma on its own schedule. The heart grieves on its own schedule. And forcing any of those processes onto this artificial timeline, it doesn't produce health. It produces the appearance of health, with the actual process still unresolved underneath. But then you have to ask yourself, what does an honest timeline look like? And that actually is the easiest part of this. There isn't one. Grief is different for different losses, for different relationships, for different people. And that causes the time frame for it to vary dramatically. So if you want to go grief for grief, comparing your timeline to someone else's is a foolish endeavor. But what matters more than a timeline is the trajectory. Are you able to function? Are you finding moments of relief between the waves? Is the grief integrating into your life rather than consuming it entirely? Those questions matter more than whether you hit some arbitrary number of months or years. And I have to say this because, again, I'm in the health and wellness business, right? But I absolutely mean this. Professional support oftentimes is worth seeking out. Not because grief itself is a disorder or anything silly like that, but because a good therapist or a good grief counselor can help you distinguish between grief that's processing on its own timeline and grief that's genuinely stuck. There's some value there. So, if you're grieving something, someone, and you feel like you should be further along than what you are, the timeline you're measuring yourself against probably was never real to begin with. And if someone you love is grieving, and it's been longer than you expected, the length of time isn't the problem. Because grief doesn't follow a timeline. Love doesn't follow a timeline. And grief is simply what love looks like after the person is gone. Well, all right, ladies and gents, that is today's episode. We'll catch up again in another couple weeks. But in the meantime, I want y'all to love on each other. There's a lot of stuff going on out there. A lot of pointless debates. There's a lot of lonely people. A lot of animosity towards one another. And I'm not going to just, ask the question, like, can't we all just get along? But can't we? Y'all keep y'all wits about you, okay? And once again, I appreciate each and every one of you that listens to this episode, that listens to this podcast. Okay? Y'all take care.